In 2021, a team of researchers led by Yale archaeologist Richard Berger did something nobody had ever actually done before with the bones sitting quietly in a museum collection in Cusco, Peru. For more than a century, historians had confidently dated the founding of Machu Picchu using nothing more than the written word of the very people who conquered and dismantled the Inca Empire, the Spanish colonizers themselves. Berger's team decided to stop trusting the conquerors' paperwork and start asking the actual skeletons buried at the site. What they found didn't just nudge the accepted historical timeline by a year or two, it rewrote it. And in the years since, an entirely separate discovery, this one written directly into ancient DNA rather than radiocarbon isotopes, revealed something about the people who actually lived and died at Machu Picchu that nobody, not even the researchers who found it, had specifically been looking for. Layer both of these genuine discoveries together with a series of laser scans that have been quietly mapping an entire hidden landscape beneath the jungle canopy surrounding the site, and you get a considerably stranger, considerably more interesting story than the postcard image of a mountaintop ruin most people carry around in their heads. This is the real story of what science has actually found buried beneath and buried within Machu Picchu. To understand why Berger's 2021 radiocarbon study landed with such genuine force in the field of Andean archaeology, you first have to understand exactly how shaky the site's accepted history actually was before his team intervened. Machu Picchu had always been dated using a specific chain of second-hand written evidence, colonial Spanish documents written decades after the fact by the very conquistadors who toppled the Inca Empire, describing when the Emperor Pachacuti supposedly rose to power. Historians had worked backward from those Spanish accounts, which placed Pachacuti's ascension around the year 1438, to estimate that construction of his mountaintop country estate, Machu Picchu itself, must have begun sometime between 1440 and 1450. For nearly a century, that second-hand, colonially filtered chronology was treated as the closest thing to settled fact anyone in the field actually had. Berger, along with Tulane archaeologist Jason Nesbitt and researchers from the University of California, Santa Cruz, decided to test that chronology directly against physical evidence rather than continuing to rely on documents written by people who had no direct involvement in the original construction and every incentive to shape the historical record in their own favor. The team turned to 26 sets of human remains that had originally been excavated from 4 separate cemeteries around Machu Picchu back in 1912 during Yale explorer Hiram Bingham's own famous expedition. Remains that had sat preserved for decades before eventually being repatriated to Peru as part of a formal 2011 agreement between Yale University and the Peruvian government, using a considerably more advanced radiocarbon technique called accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS, a method sensitive enough to extract usable dating information from even extremely small surviving fragments of organic bone and tooth material. The researchers were able to directly test human remains in a way earlier, cruder radiocarbon methods simply hadn't allowed. The results, published in the journal Antiquity in August of 2021, were genuinely striking. The skeletal evidence showed that people had been living and dying at Machu Picchu as early as 1420, a full 2 decades before the site was supposed to have even been founded according to the accepted Spanish colonial chronology, with continuous occupation stretching all the way through roughly 1530, right around the time Spanish forces were actively dismantling the Inca Empire itself. Berger himself was refreshingly direct about what this specific finding actually meant for the broader field, stating plainly that estimates of Machu Picchu's antiquity had, until his team's study, been based entirely on contradictory historical accounts, written by the exact same Spaniards who had just conquered the empire they were describing, rather than on anything resembling direct scientific evidence. The implications reached well beyond simply adjusting a single date on a single monument. If Machu Picchu was already in active use by 1420, that meant Pachacuti himself must have risen to power and begun his campaign of conquest considerably earlier than the colonial Spanish texts had ever suggested, pushing back the entire accepted timeline for how quickly the Inca transformed from a regional kingdom into the largest, most powerful empire pre-Columbian America had ever seen. Berger put it in genuinely blunt terms afterward, suggesting that the field might need a radical revision of Inca chronology altogether, and speculating, in an interview given to NPR, that researchers might even need to consider pushing some of these foundational dates back into the 14th century entirely, a genuinely significant admission that the historical foundation an entire century of Machu Picchu scholarship had been quietly built on was simply provably wrong. That same set of 26 skeletons carried an additional clue the original 1912 excavators had never been equipped to properly interpret, evidence about who these people actually were rather than simply when they lived. The bones and teeth researchers examined showed no signs of the kind of heavy, repetitive physical labor you'd expect from construction workers who had personally built the massive stone terraces and structures still standing at the site today. Instead, the physical evidence suggested these individuals were attendants who lived and served at Machu Picchu after its construction had already been completed, part of the permanent staff maintaining the emperor's mountain estate, rather than the laborers who had originally carved and hauled the stone. That distinction between builders and permanent residents turned out to matter enormously once an entirely separate team of researchers returned to examine the genetic material still locked inside those same bones, using a completely different kind of scientific analysis that hadn't even been possible back when Berger's team first ran their radiocarbon tests. In 2023, a research team that once again included Tulane's Jason Nesbitt, working alongside Yale's Richard Berger and additional colleagues, published a genuinely fascinating follow-up study in the journal Science Advances, this time turning to ancient DNA extracted directly from 34 individuals buried at Machu Picchu, comparing their genetic profiles against samples collected from populations scattered throughout the wider former territory of the Inca Empire, along with modern genomic data from across South America. The specific question driving this research was refreshingly direct: who actually lived and worked at Machu Picchu, and where had they originally come from before arriving at this remote mountain estate? As Nesbitt put it plainly when the findings were announced, the study wasn't really telling researchers something new about the elites and royalty who used Machu Picchu as a retreat. It was telling them something genuinely new about the lower status people who kept the place running, the retainer population whose lives had left almost no written record behind at all. What the genetic data revealed was a level of diversity nobody working on the project had specifically anticipated finding. Rather than discovering that Machu Picchu's permanent workforce had been drawn from a single nearby region, or even primarily from the Inca heartland surrounding Cusco itself, the DNA showed that these individuals had come from remarkably far-flung corners of the empire, tracing ancestry back to populations scattered across the full breadth of Inca-controlled territory, including groups from the Amazon rainforest, a region most people don't immediately associate with the highland, mountaintop world of Machu Picchu at all. In other words, the emperor's mountain retreat wasn't staffed by a single local ethnic community living nearby. It was maintained by a genuinely cosmopolitan mix of attendants and laborers deliberately drawn, or in many cases likely relocated, from across the entire sprawling reach of the Inca Empire, a finding that offers a considerably richer, considerably more complicated picture of daily life at the site than the postcard image of an isolated royal hideaway typically suggests. The same broader body of genetic research on Machu Picchu had actually begun years earlier as well, with an initial 2015 pilot study specifically examining ancient DNA from remains at the site to start testing exactly this kind of question about the population's underlying diversity, work that helped lay the methodological groundwork for the considerably more comprehensive 2023 findings that followed. It's also worth taking a closer look at exactly what Machu Picchu was actually built to be in the first place, because understanding its original purpose helps make sense of why researchers found such a genetically and socially layered population living there. Archaeological and historical consensus holds that Machu Picchu functioned specifically as a royal estate belonging personally to Pachacuti, rather than as a fortress, a hidden refuge, or a city built for ordinary Inca citizens, the way some popular retellings tend to imply. The site's approximately 200 surviving stone structures include a ceremonial bathhouse, multiple temples, granaries for storing food, and an intricate system of aqueducts specifically engineered to bring fresh water to the mountaintop complex, alongside residential buildings that would have housed the permanent staff of attendants, servants, and religious specialists needed to keep a royal estate of this scale actually functioning day to day. One particular structure, known today as the hut of the caretaker of the funerary rock, is believed to have served a specifically ceremonial purpose connected to the embalming of deceased Inca nobility, a detail that underscores just how much of Machu Picchu's actual daily activity revolved around religious ritual and elite service rather than any kind of large-scale permanent civilian settlement. Understanding this original purpose helps explain precisely why the genetic diversity uncovered in the 2023 DNA study was so genuinely significant, because it meant the empire was deliberately drawing skilled attendants, laborers, and religious personnel from remarkably distant corners of its own territory, specifically to staff a single royal retreat, a logistical and administrative undertaking that speaks directly to just how centralized and how genuinely sophisticated Inca imperial administration actually was less than a century before European contact. It's also worth examining more closely exactly how the ancient DNA extraction and comparison process actually worked in the 2023 Science Advances study, because the underlying methodology reveals just how far this kind of genetic archaeology has advanced in a relatively short period of time. Researchers extracted genetic material from skeletal remains using techniques specifically designed to isolate authentic ancient DNA, while filtering out the far more abundant modern contaminant DNA that inevitably accumulates on any specimen handled and stored for more than a century since its original 1912 excavation. Once clean genetic sequences were successfully isolated, the team compared them against a broad reference panel of both ancient and modern South American genomes, allowing them to statistically estimate which specific regions and populations each individual buried at Machu Picchu was most closely related to. Essentially, the same underlying comparative technique used by modern consumer ancestry testing companies, just applied here to genuinely ancient skeletal material rather than a living customer's cheek swab. This method allowed researchers to move well beyond the simple binary question of whether Machu Picchu's population was locally or distantly sourced, and toward a considerably more detailed, granular picture identifying specific likely regions of origin scattered across the empire, a level of genetic resolution that simply didn't exist for archaeologists working at the site even a single decade earlier. While Berger and Nesbitt's teams were busy extracting historical secrets directly from human bone, an entirely separate group of researchers was using a completely different technology to map what was quite literally still buried beneath the jungle floor surrounding the main citadel. Beginning in earnest around 2019 and continuing through 2024 and 2025, teams working in partnership with Peru's Ministry of Culture and, notably, a group of Polish researchers from the University of Warsaw's Center for Andean Studies began systematically applying LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, technology across the wider Machu Picchu archaeological zone. LiDAR works by firing millions of individual laser pulses down through dense vegetation from an aircraft or drone, and because a small fraction of those pulses manage to reach the actual ground surface, even through thick jungle canopy, the resulting data can be assembled into a detailed three-dimensional map of the terrain underneath, effectively letting archaeologists see straight through forest that would otherwise take years of manual clearing to properly survey on foot. The results of this specific LiDAR work have been genuinely significant, revealing more than a dozen previously unknown structures hidden beneath dense vegetation in the immediate vicinity of Machu Picchu, including one particularly notable cluster of small buildings discovered less than 5 miles from the main citadel, near a smaller ceremonial site called Chalchabamba. Published research specifically detailing this work described an intricate, previously undocumented water management system built into that same area, a network of stone-lined channels and small structures apparently engineered to control and direct water flow through the ceremonial complex, evidence of a level of hydraulic engineering sophistication that had simply never been fully mapped before this specific laser survey made it possible. Dominika Sieczkowska, Deputy Director for Organization and Development at the University of Warsaw's own Center for Andean Studies, noted that access to Machu Picchu itself had historically been an extraordinary privilege reserved for a genuinely small, elite portion of Inca society, and that these newly revealed satellite structures were helping researchers understand just how extensive and how deliberately engineered the entire surrounding ceremonial landscape actually was, well beyond the single famous citadel most visitors and photographs ever actually show. This same broader wave of remote sensing archaeology has extended considerably beyond Machu Picchu itself into the ancient Inca capital of Cusco, roughly 50 miles away, where a genuinely different kind of buried discovery has been unfolding in parallel. For centuries, local legends and scattered colonial era Spanish texts had described a network of secret underground tunnels supposedly running beneath the city, connecting the massive hilltop fortress of Sacsayhuaman to Coricancha, the Inca Empire's most important sun temple, sitting at what was once the exact religious and geographic center of the entire empire. A 1594 account written by an anonymous Spanish Jesuit specifically described an entrance to the system shaped like a serpent with its mouth open, leading down into what the writer called a labyrinth of caves and corridors easy to get lost inside. For centuries, these accounts were treated as little more than colorful colonial folklore. Then, in a project led by archaeologists Jorge Calero Flores and Mildred Fernandez Palomino, researchers combined targeted excavation, careful analysis of those same colonial records, and modern geophysical surveying tools, including acoustic prospecting, to detect hollow underground chambers and ground-penetrating radar to actually map their extent, and confirmed that a real physical tunnel system genuinely does run beneath Cusco, stretching for nearly 1.25 miles, connecting Sacsayhuaman to the Coricancha temple site exactly as those centuries-old Spanish accounts had described, along with 3 smaller branching tunnels the surveying work identified along the way. Calero Flores has specifically noted that his team believes they may have identified the exact serpent-shaped entrance described in that 1594 account, located within a section of the Sacsayhuaman complex, researchers now refer to as the H-shaped temple, complete with structural alignments that appear to correspond to specific astronomical phenomena. It's also worth exploring the specific historical irony embedded in the story of how Machu Picchu was originally excavated in the first place, because the very expedition that recovered the human remains, eventually used in both the 2021 radiocarbon study and the 2023 DNA study, has itself become a genuinely significant, still actively debated chapter of the site's modern history. Hiram Bingham III, the Yale explorer usually credited with bringing Machu Picchu to international attention following his 1911 expedition, did not actually discover the site in any meaningful sense, since local Peruvian farmers living in the surrounding Urubamba Valley had known about the ruins for generations before Bingham ever arrived, with at least one local farming family reportedly living and cultivating land directly on portions of the site itself at the time of his visit. Bingham's expedition removed thousands of artifacts and numerous sets of human remains from the site, transporting them to Yale's Peabody Museum of Natural History, where they remained for nearly a century, an arrangement that became the subject of a genuinely prolonged and, at times, genuinely tense diplomatic dispute between Peru and Yale University over rightful ownership. That dispute was finally resolved in 2011, when Yale formally agreed to return the complete collection of Machu Picchu artifacts and human remains to Peru, establishing a joint international center for the study of Machu Picchu and Inca culture in the process, an agreement that, in a genuinely fitting twist, ended up being the exact same repatriation arrangement that made those specific human remains legally and physically available for Berger's team to study a decade later, meaning the 2021 and 2023 breakthroughs were only possible at all because of a diplomatic resolution to a controversy that had absolutely nothing to do with genetics or radiocarbon dating in the first place. It's genuinely worth pausing here to note that this particular tunnel network sits beneath Cusco itself, not directly beneath Machu Picchu, a distinction that matters for keeping the actual science straight, even though both discoveries emerged from the exact same broader wave of Peruvian archaeological investigation happening simultaneously across the wider former Inca heartland throughout the mid-2020s. Taken together, though, these parallel projects, radiocarbon dating quietly rewriting when Machu Picchu was actually built, ancient DNA revealing who actually lived and worked there, LiDAR uncovering entire hidden satellite complexes within the surrounding jungle, and ground-penetrating radar confirming genuine underground tunnel networks running beneath the empire's own capital city, paint a picture of a civilization whose physical and administrative footprint was considerably larger, considerably more interconnected, and considerably more sophisticated than the relatively simple, isolated mountain fortress image most people carry around from postcards and travel brochures. What makes this entire, genuinely ongoing body of research so consistently compelling isn't any single dramatic headline moment. It's the fact that each new discovery keeps quietly overturning assumptions that had gone unchallenged for the better part of a century, simply because nobody previously had the specific tools necessary to actually test them against hard physical evidence. Historians spent 100 years accepting a Spanish colonial chronology for Machu Picchu's founding because there was, quite simply, no better alternative available, until accelerator mass spectrometry finally gave researchers a way to ask the site's own buried skeletons directly. Archaeologists had no real way of knowing where Machu Picchu's ordinary workers and attendants had actually come from, since colonial records focused almost entirely on emperors and elites, rather than the retainer population that kept the estate physically running, until ancient DNA sequencing gave those same forgotten individuals a genetic voice their own society never bothered recording and writing. And for centuries, an entire underground tunnel network sat quietly beneath one of South America's most thoroughly studied ancient cities, dismissed as folklore precisely because nobody had yet pointed the right combination of acoustic sensors and ground-penetrating radar at the specific ground, where colonial legend had told them, all along, exactly where to look.